This is a little introductory course on philosophy called Aquinas Alive. And the goal of this little course is simply to introduce the concepts, the language, the principles of Thomistic philosophy to the high school student. I call it a kind of easy listening introduction to the philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas. It's not meant to be something that requires a lot of study. It's not meant to be something that requires a lot of work. It's something to listen to, just to sit and listen to, or listen to while you're driving, or listen to even as part of your homeschool day, to give you an introduction to the philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas, which is the philosophy of the Church, we could call it. It is the patrimony of Catholicism, and it is something that is not as well known as it should be. This is a course that I've designed for my own high school children. I'm giving it to one of my high school children at the moment. I will give it to the others as they get older. And in the course of giving this introduction, we decided to tape it with my daughter's permission. We decided to record it, and that way this could be distributed to others, hopefully as a help. Again, the course is meant to be easy listening. It's not meant to be a burden or difficult or something that requires a lot of homework or study. And it's intended to be fun because philosophy is good. Philosophy is satisfying. Philosophy makes us happy. And true philosophy is fun. So this is John Vennari, and I hope that you enjoy listening to this course.
St. Thomas Aquinas, pray for us. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen. Okay, this is our first class/discussion on philosophy. And the definition of philosophy is?
Search and knowledge of all things through their ultimate causes in the light of the principles of reason.
Very good. Done without notes. Let's get that memorized. So what we're going to be doing in these opening points is some background and exactly the layout of what we're going to be doing, what is philosophy, and we're going to see a couple of examples of philosophy in action. So you see what it does. Because what it does is it clarifies the mind, it gives you the ability to make distinctions, which is one of the main problems, one of the main deficiencies in modern thinking. They blend all these things together and they don't make distinctions. And we'll get an example of that from Brian McCall a little later on. So the first point that you want to make is that we're not going to study a history of philosophy. Dr. Waters always said that was the worst way to teach philosophy. You get a whole survey of what all these people thought, but you don't know what anything is. He told the story of a philosophy student that he met who was studying that way, and he said, I could tell you what everybody thought. I could tell you what Descartes thought, and what Kant thought, and what Spinoza thought, and what all these people thought. But if you ask me which one was right, I have no idea. He didn't know. So it's kind of like doing it that way is like studying a history of architecture. You would study the Romantic style or Gothic style or this style, that style.
And Frank Lloyd Wright.
Frank Lloyd Wright and Corbusier and all these people. And someone says, well, how do you build a building? You go, I have no idea. And so Dr. Waters used to say that studying a history of philosophy might be good if you can spend 200 years doing it, because that's how long it would take. But so we're not going to do that. And the reason I say that from the beginning is because I don't know if it's still done this way, but throughout the seminaries, what they did is they got rid of these Scholastic Philosophy courses and they replaced it with a history of philosophy. So the seminarians still saw on their resume that their roster that they were getting philosophy, but they didn't know that they actually had the rug pulled out from under them, and they got a history. I remember Father Rueda complained about that. So we're going to study the philosophical sciences that give us certitude. I think it's Feser opens up by saying that this is not a museum piece. It's not just something we're going to just go and see what Aquinas thought way back when, and isn't that nifty? But he doesn't have any. That's why one of the reasons we're calling the course Aquinas Alive, because it's for here and it's for now. And I remember the first class I had with Dr. Waters, I was so impressed because one of the first things he said, because remember how buoyant he was, and he said, "We have the answers. We have the answers to the major problems of our time. It's here, through the philosophy of St. Thomas." And I was electrified by that because I knew it was true. We have the answers. And it's interesting because you can see how the teaching of philosophy became corrupted or weakened over time, because Cardinal Ratzinger, who came to be Pope Benedict XVI, writing in his book Milestones about his seminary days, he said he had no interest in St. Thomas Aquinas, the philosophy of St. Thomas, and no love of it. He said it was static, it was too turned in itself, and it didn't answer the vital problems of the day. Now, what that tells me is that he had bad teachers. Because if he had a Dr. Bennett, or if he had a Dr. Waters, or if he had a Dr. Feser, there's no way he could say that, because it does answer the major questions of the day, and it gives you the tools to work things out. We're going to see a little bit of that with Dr. McCall. Maybe the second or third class we're going to go through something that Dr. Woodbury did on education. And you can see philosophy in action, and the nuts and bolts of it, how it works. And so that's what we're going to do. We're going these few classes will be an introduction, and then we're going to go straight into metaphysics, about say third or fourth class in, and we're going to study act and potency and the four causes. Can you name the four causes by any chance? Do you remember them? Want to take a stab at it?
Ketchup, mustard, salt, and pepper.
Efficient cause, formal cause, material cause, and
Final cause.
Final cause. Very good. Yeah. So we'll be going through that. So we'll do that. We're going to go through this introduction, which might take a couple of classes. We're going to go shooting into some of the main points of metaphysics, and then we're going to go and study a little history of the Greeks, from Thales to to Anaxagoras, through Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and that study of the Greeks we're going to do fairly quickly. If you want to do more reading on your own, you can, but we'll do that fairly quickly, because the main thing is as I said, not to study the history, but to know what's true. Do I have that line from Aquinas? Here's Aquinas speaking. He said, "The study of philosophy is not about knowing what individual thought." Let me say that again. The study of philosophy is not knowing about... I can't read. Let me do this one more time. Me. The study of philosophy is not about knowing what individuals thought, but the way things are.
Now, can you repeat that one word at a time so that I can copy it down?
Yes. The study of philosophy
Philosophy. Okay.
is not about knowing what individuals thought.
Is not about... No, I don't know shorthand. What individuals thought,
but the way things are. So one of the things we're going to see with St. Thomas is he's always locked into hard rock reality. Everything with him is what is real, what is true. And as Dr. Waters says, when we know what is good and true, the good and the true is what makes the beautiful. But we'll get that. So again, and even this course too at high school level, this is an introduction. And I'll give you little things to read. I'm not going to give you anything to read today, but probably starting next week I'll give you little things to read, so you can. Because one of the things, and we'll get back to this when we get to the little clip from Dr. McCall. One of the main things we want philosophy to do is we don't want it to be, a subject like the history of the Peloponnesian Wars, where you learn it and it doesn't have any real impact on the way you think, on how you how you make distinctions. But what philosophy is supposed to do is you develop the habits of thinking properly. You develop the habits of making distinctions. You develop the habit of seeing things clearly. And something that is really, really, really lacking in our time is the ability to be objective. You know what that means?
Nope.
The ability to be objective is to be able to stand back and look at something as it is, no matter how it affects me, whether I like it or not, whether I agree with it or not.
So would it be basically unbiased?
Unbiased, yeah, that's another word for it, unbiased. But you look at it as it really is. You look at things as they are. You have a certain detachment from what you're studying, what you're trying to understand, what you're looking at, and so that your emotions don't get in the way. And your feelings. Right now, everything's based on feeling. How did you feel when you won $10 million? Or how do you think I felt? I mean, how do you everything now? The news people don't say. They say, "How did you feel?" They don't say, "What did you think?" And this gives you the ability to think clearly, to make distinctions. So, one of the reasons too. Yeah, and also our class, the little classes we have here, they're going to be more in the area of informal discussions or informal conversations, but we will be teaching, but more in that way. Now, St. Thomas Aquinas has always been hated by those who love error or those who really don't understand him. They try to get rid of him. I don't know if you remember, was it in Dr. McCall's or Dr. Hornowski's talk where
I didn't hear either.
He didn't hear either. Well, Martin Luther knew that if he destroyed Aquinas, he would destroy the Catholic Church. And Luther called out for, because he was burning books.
Oh, right. I remember Dr. Hornowski.
Yeah. And they were burning books. Martin Luther was burning books he didn't like. And he called for everyone to burn the Summa. And nobody did it because nobody wanted to part with their copy, because they knew how valuable it was. Even if old, dumb, stupid Martin Luther didn't know. So, but Aquinas is the enemy of modern thinking, because modern thinking claims that everything is always in a state of flux. Everything's always moving. Nothing is really permanent. When it comes to truth, when it comes to morals, when it comes to proper understanding of things, nothing is fixed. Everything's in movement. And you even hear, well, we'll give an example of that from Barak later on. But you even hear people say, "Oh, well, that's so 19th century. This is the 21st century. We don't do that now. We don't think like that now." Well, it's in some fashions, yes, maybe, but as far as what is truth and what is morality, those things are fixed because they are objective. But the idea that everything is in a state of flux, we're going to see that this is actually an ancient error that goes back to a man named Heraclitus. He believed that nothing was permanent, everything was in flux. We're not going to cover that now. But it resurfaced at the time of modernism. Here is a proposition of modernism that Pius X had to condemn at the turn of the 19th into the 20th century. Truth is no more immutable than man himself, since it evolved with him, in him, and through him. So man is always changing, as it were, going from boyhood to man to older man. And so, because man is always changing, you see the inability to make the distinction. Therefore, truth will always change. And when you have Catholics talking like this, you lose all stability. And that's what Pius XII said in the 1940s. One of the reasons we have to study St. Thomas is because St. Thomas has been pushed aside by churchmen themselves. Father Henri Bouillard, he's a proponent of the new theology, and he said in the 1940s, he said, a theology which is not current, in other words, that doesn't keep changing, will be a false theology. So that's the error of our time, that everything has to change, everything has to keep moving, everything is in a state of flux, nothing is permanent. And Pope Pius XII warned against this new theology. You heard me talk about the new theology quite a bit. But here's what Pius XII had to say to Jesuits in 1946. And knowing Father Juhas, he was probably there for this speech. Because he was everywhere at the right time. He said, there is a good deal of talk, but without the necessary clarity of concept, about a new theology which must be in constant transformation, following the example of all other things in the world, which are in a constant state of flux and movement without ever reaching their term. You know what that means? Without ever reaching their end. Term, end, terminal. If we were to accept such an opinion, he said, what would become of the unchanging dogmas of the Catholic faith, and what would become of the unity and stability of that faith? So Pius sees clearly, once you start saying that all truth changes, then there's no such thing as a dogma that doesn't change. Everything's going to be moving, and that's, I'm not going to get into this now, but I think you can see that is basically what happened at Vatican II. That this type of thinking, that everything has to change, took over.
It's like in the loved one.
Where in the loved one?
Once you start changing your name.
Once you start changing a name, there's no reason ever to stop it. That's right, because there's no. Who said that? Amy Thanatogenes said that. But anyway, but where we really see this is in the realm of morals. It's Obama. It's Obama, October 13, 2009, talking to a rainbow group, we'll call them, called the Human Rights Campaign. And it's the rainbow group, and of course, and their straight supporters and sympathizers, which we have a lot of. He says, despite the real gains that we've made, there are still laws to change, still hearts to open. There are still fellow citizens, perhaps neighbors, even loved ones, good and decent people, who hold fast to outworn arguments and old attitudes, who fail to see your families like their families, who would deny you the rights most Americans take for granted, and that's painful and heartbreaking. Okay? So, but what's he saying is, he's taking objective moral law, the Ten Commandments, the law that comes from God, that is fixed, that can change, and he is connecting it to something, attitudes that should change over time. You know, almost like in the 1950s, the movie-going public, they loved musicals. Well, today they don't like musicals, so you don't give them... So there's no movies that are musicals. Okay? Well, that type of thing can change with no problem, but you can't say, because tastes change and public, you know, just a public mood changes. But he is saying that this sin that cries to heaven for vengeance is just a time-bound attitude that can change over time, and we are the smart ones who have made this change, but you have friends and family members who are still stuck in the 19th century and haven't come along with us. So he's taking objective moral truth and submitting it to this error that everything is always in a state of flux. Okay. So as I said, Aquinas is the enemy of those who despise truth or who don't understand scholasticism. And in 1945, they were trying to get rid of St. Thomas, even in the seminaries. And there was an academic review called L'Études de France. Oui,
You do not pronounce anything
Yeah,
with you.
yes, right. When you speak French, you cannot move your mouth. And 1945 Academic Review L'Etudes speaks of this Father Gaston Fessard. He says he speaks of, I'm quoting now, the blissful drowsiness that protects Thomism, which is canonized, but also, as Piguet used to say, buried it. Okay, so that's the bad news. Aquinas was buried. The good news is that he was buried alive. He's still there for us, and we're going to be part of this large group of people now who are going back to Thomas, who are digging him up and letting him breathe and letting him speak to us again. Good grief. I'm going to go straight to the video portion of our presentation, because we have to. I had here the heading of what is philosophy. You answered that again.
Yeah. Certain knowledge of all things through their ultimate causes in the light of the principles of reason.
Certain knowledge of all things through their ultimate causes in the light of the principles of reason. So probably in the next class we'll explain that a little bit, or as they say now, we'll unpack it a little more. We'll also go through why study philosophy. And one of the things, as I said, that philosophy does is it gives you the ability to think clearly. It's something you use. I remember back when I was living in Jersey, I bumped into a paper salesman for Garrett Buchanan Paper. And we got talking about, he was an older man, and we got talking about Thomistic philosophy. And he said, I went to university with the Jesuits from 1948 to 1952. He said, when I was there, I had the full 4-year classic curriculum of Scholastic Philosophy. He says, I use it every day. I use what I was learned on the principles of truth and clear thinking and the ability to make distinctions. I use it every day. And that's what it does. It helps us to make distinctions, and you form the habit of thinking clearly. And so here I want to go to Brian McCall, because you're going to see that Brian McCall is asked a question, and it's not, that's the point of philosophy, is that you use it with everything. You just don't use philosophy in philosophy class. You use it for everything. And Brian McCall, he gave a talk about the fact that about separation of church and state. That, as Leo XIII, separation of church and state is really like separating the soul from the body. And what happens to the body when the soul is separated from it?
You die.
It's dead. And that's why today we have a dead society, because there's no soul left. We have zombies. I think that's why zombies are so popular. Zombie movies. I think people instinctively know that we live in a zombie culture. We live in a culture of bodies without souls. So he gave that talk, and then you're going to see that the question from the audience, enunciated by Mr. Diaz, that they ask, well, what aren't you then, if you're saying that the church and the state shouldn't be separated, aren't you calling for this kind of theocracy that the Muslims want? All right? And so watch Dr. Brian McCall immediately makes 3 distinctions as part of his answer. You can listen to this.
Dr. McCall, in your speech today, in which you suggested that the widely accepted idea that there ought to be a separation between church and state is in fact an error of Russia warned about by Our Lady of Fatima, your speech prompted several questions from people in attendance at the conference. One wanted to know whether, since you are opposed to a separation of church and state, are you suggesting that the ideal form of government is a theocracy in a form similar to those found in Islamic nations today?
It's a very good question, because it's distinctions that need to be drawn. There are really 3, in my mind, distinctions between the proper Catholic teaching on the harmonious relationship between the church and civil society, as Leo XIII described it. And the first of those is the theocracy of the Islamic teaching, is a relationship not between civil society and the Church of Jesus Christ, but a relationship between civil society and no church. Because, of course, they don't have a church. And so the first distinction is what they teach is not a relationship between church and civil society, but moving to the second point, really, is a relationship between civil society and a false religion. And obviously that is distinct from what I was explaining as the traditional Catholic teaching. And related to that is that when we understand the role that that relationship is, that's to guard and promote and teach the principles of the natural and divine law, which the Church is the guardian of. Now, the role of those principles, as we tried to discuss this morning, is to aid human reason. And so there's a relationship between reason and faith. Remember, God, through the eternal law, wants man to understand. And so faith, the Church, the teaching of the Church, is meant to clarify the confusion that arose from the wounding from the fall. So it's not meant to be an irrational teaching. Just believe this and don't understand it. It's meant to enhance and make us more able to do what we were designed to do, to have reason. The Islamic teaching is contrary to that. And it's interesting because it is the point that the Holy Father was trying to make in Regensburg, which the media destroyed because they distorted everyone's attention. And he was trying to explain that that was the problem with Islamic understanding of faith, is that it obliterates reason and is a faith without reason. And interesting, some of the media didn't report. A very, very small group of Muslim scholars thanked the Holy Father and said, "Thank you. We've been trying to say this." Because the Islamic tradition since the Middle Ages, when they tried to establish philosophy and it was defeated, has obliterated philosophical, reasonable thinking. And this small group who actually thanked the Holy Father for what he said. He said, "This is what we've been trying to say to our Muslim colleagues." And so that's the second distinction, that what that asks for is an obliteration of reason in light of an irrational faith. And finally, the third distinction is, again, even if you analogize it to a relationship between church and state, remember the relationship that Leo XIII talks about is a relationship where the church and the state are distinct but not separate. So it's distinct but not separate, distinct but related. And the spheres of operation of the civil society and the church are different. They're distinct, related to the natural and the supernatural ends, but they're related. And when they come into conflict, when there is a decision which impedes the supernatural end, it's in that sense that the civil society is subordinate. And the Muslim idea is a subordination of civil ruling authority to their false religion. And so they are completely dominated by it, rather than being supported by making these distinctions and providing this. So it's very, very important because it's used by the enemies of the church's doctrine as a scare tactic. Oh, this is what Muslims want to teach, and that's what and it's not at all. If you look at the true teaching of the church, you can make these clear distinctions.
Thank you, Dr. McCall, for that clarification. Another conference attendee wondered.
Wow.
So you see what he was able to do because he has the ability to make distinctions. First thing he said is that the first distinction is we're not talking about separation of church and state and church, because what? Because Muslims are no church. They're a false religion. Secondly, the church is meant to aid and support natural and divine law, to support human reason, but the Muslim system is really an irrational belief system. They just say, here's the Quran, believe it. A lot of people have pointed out that in the Quran there's all these contradictions that the Quran itself doesn't hold together because one part of it contradicts another part. Okay, so we're dealing with civil society and a false religion, and then third, the way that the religion, the government and the church are separate. They're distinct but not separate. In that, as Father Fahey would say, church and state exercise their authority over one subject, man. The modern way is for the modern man to cut himself in half and say, well, the Catholic part of me will do this on Sunday, and the secular part of me will do this from Monday to Saturday. And you end up with people who are schizophrenic. Because but it is that the church and the state are both operating on man, and if there is a conflict, between divine law and human law, then divine law has to take precedence.
Because it's divine.
Yeah, and so the principles of the faith are preeminent, and basically we base our laws of right and wrong on what the gospel teaches is right and wrong. Church teaches right and wrong. The details of the answer are somewhat secondary, but what you saw he was able to do in a flash was to make distinctions, and then once he made his three distinctions, then he answered in an organized fashion from one point to the next, And that is what Thomistic philosophy gives you the ability to do. You make distinctions, you see them clearly, and then you are able to... but it doesn't mean, of course, that the ability for you to do this means that you're going to win an argument. Because if you're talking with someone, you have to be able to talk to someone who has the ability to follow a rational argument. And Matthew Faust, when he was in high school, he would have these friendly discussions with his friends, and the discussions would just go off a cliff. Because in the end... Matthew was talking to someone about evolution. He was, saying all the points against evolution. And his friend said, yeah, well, I still believe it. But look at this. Yeah, well, I still believe it. And Matthew said, why do you still believe it? And his friend said, because I want to. So the intellect is not working in that person, and the will. So winning an argument with someone else is secondary. Primary is the ability to think clearly, to make distinctions, and that's what philosophy does, and that closes out our first class.
Thank you.
So next time we're going to talk about what is philosophy, why study philosophy, probably the branches of philosophy. That's what we'll do next.
Okay.
There's 7 branches that we'll talk about. But we are only going to be, of the 7, we will be dealing with metaphysics, philosophy and human nature, and the next year, ethics.
Okay.
So there we are.
Okie dokie.
Does it make sense?
Yes, it does.